Okay. Sure.
Ben, it's great to meet you, sir. Thank you for taking a minute out.
Hey, great to meet you. Thanks for inviting me. Yeah.
Yeah, so I have a jazz radio show, so seeing the trumpet and seeing what you're doing and this innovation's wonderful. So, where are you coming out of, first and foremost?
Beacon, New York, just
Okay,
north of New York City. I've been based in New York City and this area for 40 years. Yeah.
okay. Well, I'm coming from a jazz cradle here in Kansas City, so it's great to meet you. I want to begin our journey into your life and your instruments and music and everything that you're doing by asking you this. 5 years ago, COVID began, threw us all into a tailspin. How did you get through that time period, and how has it influenced and radiated into your world today?
Interesting question. It actually prompted me to create a project that was something unlike anything I'd ever done before. I did a collaboration with my longtime production partner. Of course, we weren't in physical, the same place. We did it online, but I released 2 tracks a week for a year. So I put out 104 tracks over from, I think it was November 2020 to November 2021. And they were much more in the purely new age meditative kind of style, very much tailored for, what I felt people needed, and frankly, for my own sanity. It was a practice that just kept me engaged with music when I couldn't perform publicly or anything. So it was, and technically, it was a kind of new way of working that I developed during that time, which is that now carried over into the newer music that I'm doing. I've just started releasing some new music in the last week. I'll be putting out a new track each month for the next few months. So yeah, it was very unique, but it definitely has carried on and had an influence on what I'm doing up to today. Yeah.
So, if I put you in front of a bunch of grade school kids right now, career day, sixth graders, and they wanted to know what you did for a living, and the kid in the back of the room is like, "Hey, what do you do for a living?" How do you
Yeah.
answer them?
Well, I'm a composer, performer, and instrument inventor. I've also been a professor of music technology and music business for 20 years. And yeah, I've had done 14 albums, toured all over the world, and continue to be active as a musician. And I'm also an author. I just had my first book come out in December. Yeah.
So, how did you get into music? Was that always your dream to be a musician and to get into this field?
I was attracted to music early on. I came from a musical family. My grandmother was a piano teacher. My mother was quite musical as well. There was a lot of music in the home growing up. My grandmother kind of forced me to learn some piano and some music theory, somewhat to against my wishes sometimes. But I'm very glad that she did. She kind of instilled some of that into me from an early age. And yeah, I got interested in guitar first, just growing up listening to rock and roll, and but then as I went on through school, I started playing trumpet and got more interested in that, and then that's what I pursued from there. Yeah.
So, talk to me a little bit about early influences. Who were musicians that swayed you and influenced the way that you were going to approach your voice on the instrument?
Well, I grew up listening to a lot of different kinds of music. I did study classical trumpet at the North Carolina School of the Arts, which was in my hometown in Winston-Salem. But I grew up listening to a lot of art rock, David Bowie, Brian Eno, that whole genre, Todd Rundgren. So I guess I was, I was interested in things that were pushing my own envelope of what I had experienced through music. I mean, of course, I heard the Beatles growing up, but I also got interested in improvised music, Miles Davis, particularly his more fusion oriented music that he was doing in the 70s, and the kind of improvisation that we would find on the ECM label a lot. And then in addition to to classical music and more contemporary classical music like minimalism, Philip Glass, Steve Reich, John Cage, going back a little bit earlier. So it's a mix. Yeah, it's a mix. Yeah.
So, when you were young, what was the first live show you saw that was seminal that made you think, I want to do this one day, or had a lasting impact on you?
You know, the first I that's it was not a major concert. It was really I had been playing trumpet for a few years, and when I was in, I guess it was around maybe eighth or ninth grade, we had a brass quintet come to our school, and I ended up studying with one of the trumpet players in the quintet for a few years after that. But that was the first time that I had seen that kind of virtuosity on brass instruments. And I was just, really wowed by it. And I think that was really the moment when I thought, yeah, I mean, I really want to do this. I really want to get good at that,
Yeah.
and yeah, so that was a real, that was a real turning point for me. Yeah.
So, who's been a hero for you? Who's been an inspiration for you all these years?
Well, one of my big heroes was John Hassel, who I don't even know if you're familiar with him. I mean, he's not super well known, but he was a trumpet player who he passed away a few years ago, but he was a trumpet player who I got to know originally through his records with Brian Eno. He had done a couple of records with Brian Eno in the late 70s, and he had come up with a very unusual way of playing trumpet where he put the mouthpiece on his lips very lightly so that air was actually escaping out of the corners of his lips a little bit. And then he ran that through a harmonizer. It was inspired by his work with an Indian raga singer, Pandit Pranath, who a lot of the minimalist composers, Lamont Young, who I also studied with a lot, who has been another big inspiration to me, and Terry Riley, they both studied with Pandit Pranath. But his reinvention, reimagination, I guess, of the trumpet was something that was really exciting to me. And when I first came to New York, I wrote him a letter, and amazingly, he wrote back to me, and he became a real mentor for me and introduced me to many of the people that I ended up working with, including Lamont Young and Reese Chatham and a number of the people in the New York City music scene that I worked with for many years. So he was a really central figure for me in terms of both a role model, but then also as someone who was really a catalyst for getting my career going and giving me the confidence to actually go forward with this idea that I had to create my own instrument when it was just really a fledgling thing that I wasn't sure was even really worth pursuing. Yeah.
So let's get into the mutant trumpet, the hybrid electroacoustic invention that you have, and it's a part of diffusing music. Talk to me about the beginnings and how you crafted this instrument, and then let's get into the book and what it leads the reader through.
Sure. I had been playing a lot of music when I was studying that would require a lot of mute changes, uh, more experimental pieces, John Cage and things like that. And I got the idea that rather than having to stick mutes in and out all the time, what if I had an extra bell? So I had a trumpet that I could remove the bell from. It was a tuning bell trumpet, and I started experimenting just sticking that onto the first valve slide. Well, but that meant I couldn't really use the first valve as a normal valve anymore. So after fooling around with that, I was excited by the idea that I could use the valve to switch between an open or two different muted sonorities. It created a sound that reminded me of an electronic sound, almost like a filter sweep, a timbre shift. So I happened to be playing in a brass quintet with a guy who had worked at the King Instrument Factory, and we said, "Hey, let's try to make one where let's put an extra set of valves on it so I could switch between different sounds." And so it ended up with having three bells, and one of the bells we put a piccolo trumpet bell on one of that would and attached it to a piece of a trombone slide. So yeah, it started out very crude. We used some old student trumpets to begin with, but then I started really getting more interested in it. Really, and the way I first started using it was in the context of the whole punk new wave scene in Northeast Ohio. I was going to school at Youngstown State in Ohio, and Devo had been from that area, and so there was a really lively club scene around punk rock and new wave in the early '80s. And I also had thought about adding electronics to it. And around that time, I saw an ad in the back of Keyboard magazine that Robert Moog, the synthesizer inventor, was looking for independent projects. He had sold his interest in the Moog company at that time. And I approached him, and he got very excited about it. He was really interested in it. We became friends, and he invited me to his home. And actually, this analog processing system that's sitting behind me here is the original pitch to voltage system with analog modules that he put together for me. So that was, kind of how it started, and then just kept going from there.
Speaking of keeping going from there, as a musician, as a music mind, what is it that gets you up every day? What is it that's consistently made you be allured by this music and to evolve as an artist?
Well, I have been very driven to make my own music since I started doing it. I really started writing my own music around that time in the early '80s. I was doing, yeah, like I mentioned, I was in some punk new wave bands, and I played some guitar and sang and different things. But one of the things about New York, I remember an old friend of mine who was living in New York when I moved to the city said that New York really drives you to your strengths because no matter what it is that you're doing, there are people there that are doing it really well. So I really, once I got to New York, I started really focusing on the trumpet. And yeah, I've been very compelled to keep creating new music, but also developing new technology alongside of it. My work with the Mutant Trumpet became more and more involved with, of course, MIDI originally, and then interactive computer music and interactive video. So it's a process of discovering new things all the time. And I think for me, the thing that is the most exciting about working with the technology in particular is when I'm able to set something in motion that surprises me pleasantly, something that I don't necessarily imagine the whole thing being worked out in my mind, where I set a process in motion that comes back at me and it feels expressive. That to me is a kind of magic. And I'm not saying I achieve that every time every day, but I'm always striving for that. And I think it's that sense of something magical that is so compelling to me about continuing to be a creative person, to be devoted to creativity. Yeah.
So I watched a documentary the other night on Clive Davis, and at one point, Miles Davis came in the room with him,
Yeah.
and
I haven't seen that, but yeah.
Oh, you need to see it. It's really cool. And I had no idea how cool Clive is. Like, I
Yeah.
just didn't know his allure and how he got into it. It's fascinating. But at
Right.
one point, and this won't give anything away, it's going to hedge on my next
Yeah, yeah,
question.
yeah.
Miles comes in the room, and Miles was a pistol. Like, he just always had vitriol and vinegar. And he
Yeah.
was like, all of these guys are ripping my music off. I'm tired of it. And Clive said, look, you need to come to the Monterey Festival with me. You need to be in it. You need to watch these cats, these electronic people doing what they're doing. Bowie, everybody.
Yeah.
So after that, that's when Bitches Brew came out, and
Yeah.
it was kind of his real proverbial way of ditching the whole acoustic thing. So my question to you is this: is someone that created this hybrid instrument, we see all these advancements in electronic music. The music industry tends to revert to, like, we've gone back to vinyl and tapes. No one thought that was going to happen, and it's become a bastion for music. Do you see in that Miles Davis mentality us reverting back to a level of acoustic, that warm analog honey? Or do you think that it's okay that we've minced in all of these electronic pieces and that's our new frontier, and going back would maybe be a full reversion of what we're doing as music people?
I see what's happening in music is that it's going more and more into the technological, and what my book is really about is that music is becoming more and more participatory, so that it's not really enough for people to just listen to a recording. Like, people actually want to get involved in making music. And we see that with the incredible abundance of music that's being made, with 120,000 songs a day being released. And so, yeah, I mean, to me, the whole interest in vinyl, I mean, I can appreciate it. I have a couple friends that are audiophiles, and it's fun to sit and listen to compare a 2496 stream to a vinyl recording played on a nice turntable. And I think some things, and when you're really putting it under a microscope like that, I think, there is something to the fact that the warmth of the analog is preferable. But I mean, I think in terms of certainly the overall picture of the music industry, while I know vinyl and even cassettes have seen a kind of comeback, it's pretty minor
Yeah.
economically in the grander scheme of things. And I just see the democratization of music as being, really where things are going, and that is very much tied into electronics. Now, that being said, I with my interest was always and not so different from Miles. I mean, my interest was never to play a wind controller that didn't have that where I still wasn't actually playing the trumpet.
Yeah.
My whole concept was always to marry the electronic realm with conventional acoustic performance, and try to come up with all kinds of new ways of interfacing those things. So for me, that's still really where my interest is. So in that sense, I do maintain the traditional, and I think one thing I'll say is that I think we're in a world where just about anybody, even, a little kid, can stick some loops together, or, there are all these different kinds of software instruments and games where you can, produce music and release a song, if, put it up on YouTube, put it on Spotify or whatever. But I think live performance, we've seen that the economic value of live performance, particularly, of course, at the top of the business, has continued to go up and up and up. But live performance is still sort of, I feel, what creates a divide, because it's one thing I know, and you're interested in jazz, and I've gotten more and more interested in improvisation. When I first started out, I was more focused on composing, creating things that were more fixed. Excuse me. But I think for somebody to get up on a stage and be able to improvise, that's still, and do something compelling, that is more traditional in a sense. But I think it's a lot different from just putting together a couple of sounds on your iPhone.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
I totally agree.
Yeah.
So, of this life of creativity and everything that you've done in your life, what are you ultimately the proudest of?
Hmm. That's a good one. Um, the proudest of. I I would say, oddly enough, I think some of the things that I am most excited about, looking back over my recordings and was the way in which I was able to bring together a lot of different elements. In the early 2000s, I started doing music for television commercials. I got approached by an ad agency that was doing music for doing the ads for Volkswagen. And they liked my music, and they wrote me and said, "Hey, would you ever be interested in doing music for a commercial?" And I ended up doing a lot of music for Volkswagen. It was almost like having a record deal
Yeah.
with a car company. And I did this project called Automotive, which was a real hybrid model of, so there was the brand of Volkswagen, the ad agency, and then I got an independent record label involved because after I'd done like a dozen of these ads, it was music that I liked. It wasn't like they were telling me to make something that wasn't really my music. And it was really exciting to me to turn on the TV and see something that I had made that I was really proud of, that was, going out to millions of people on the Olympics and things like that. And so that project where I brought together, and the album then was called Automotive, and then I did a tour of all the House of Blues clubs all over the country. I feel like in a lot of ways, and I actually took a lot of flack for that. I mean, a lot of people from the more hardcore experimental world really didn't like that. They thought it was a big sellout. But ultimately, that was in 2002, I think, Automotive, the record came out and the tour and everything. But ultimately, I felt like in a lot of ways, that was probably the most successful thing I did. And ultimately, it became a real model for musicians that, whereas it used to be kind of taboo to even talk about, oh, I'm doing a music for a commercial or something. Now it's one of the best things that can happen for an artist. I mean, you think about, people getting their music into an Apple ad or, something like that. A lot of times that's like the way that people break. So that's definitely one of the high points.
Yeah. So Diffusing Music is the new book. You
Yeah.
have plenty of music out on streaming services. What's the best way for people to fully delve into your world and participate more?
My website, benneill.com. Yeah.
Okay.
Neil with two L's. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yeah, I will make sure to spell that correctly. I'll get the links in there. Ben, this has been a joy. I love what you're doing. Thank you so much. And hello, friends. Joe Dimino here. I just wanted to let you know that after 30 years or so, I have finally released my first book of poetry through the mighty Spartan Press here in Kansas City, Missouri. As the creator and host of both Neon Jazz Radio and the Famous Interviews with Joe Dimino podcast, along with being a visual artist, I'm ready to embark on a new adventure and want you to be a part of it. You can get a copy online via Barnes & Noble, Amazon, and actually on the streets in Kansas City at the great Prospero's bookstore off 39th Street. You can also visit joedimino.com for links to the book, to more poetry, and everything in my world, including paintings. Thanks for all of the love and support over the years, and please dig the words.